Welcome to Treasures of the Jewish World. In our last program, we discussed the historical persecution of the Jewish people and visited the Yad Vashem War Memorial in Jerusalem. We noted in our past program the history of the persecution of the Jews centered over the claim by Christians that it had been the Jews that killed Jesus. In today's program, we're going to attempt to answer this question. Who did kill Jesus? And we're going to begin by taking you first of all to a tomb complex in Jerusalem dating back to the 1st century, a site traditionally believed to be that of the members of the Sanhedrin of Jesus' day. And then we'll go to a new museum in the restored Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, just recently opened to the public, where we have excavated the homes of the wealthy members of the Jewish aristocracy of the 1st century. These homes were undoubtedly those of the sect of the Sadducees, who we believe were the luxury-loving members of the court. And it was to the heart of their teaching, practices, and beliefs that Jesus struck a blow in his teaching. And it was, we believe, the Sadducees who were those that conspired against and were indirectly responsible for the death of Jesus. We will have the unique opportunity of being guided through this new museum by one of my colleagues, Professor Amichai Mazar, Professor of Archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and one of the excavators of this unique and fascinating treasure. A short distance north of Jerusalem is this interesting tomb complex, known as the Tomb of the Sanhedrin. As a matter of fact, the whole area is known as Sanhedria after this tomb, which dates back to the 1st century. According to tradition, the members of the great Sanhedrin were buried in this tomb. Above the entrance, the artistically carved facade is decorated with pomegranates, citrons, acanthus leaves, all typical of 1st and 2nd century tombs. There are 3 levels or stories in the tomb, each story containing a number of alcoves in which a stone coffin containing the body of the deceased would be placed. The great Sanhedrin was the supreme court of Israel in biblical days, and if you will remember, consisted of 71 members and met in the temple area. It's quite possible that here in this tomb, the members of the great Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus to death were buried. All of this raises not just an interesting, but a most important question. Just exactly who was responsible for the death of Jesus? Who killed Jesus? It was not, as some have recently claimed, the Pharisees. Those who conspired together for the death of Jesus represented the temple aristocracy, the luxury-loving members of the court, whose hypocrisy Jesus frequently denounced and whose wrath he frequently incurred. These luxury-loving members of the aristocracy belonged to the sect of the Jews known as the Sadducees, although there were undoubtedly representatives of other Jewish sects who were in sympathy with them. Basically, we're talking about the Sadducees, and not, again I emphasize, the Pharisees. Those who are acquainted with Jewish law and the 4 methods for putting a person to death for a capital crime know that crucifixion was the Roman method of capital punishment and not a Jewish one. The Sadducees and the other members of the temple aristocracy, in league with certain members of the Sanhedrin, conspired together for the death of Jesus. Certainly, many of these also sat on the Sanhedrin. But we must remember that it was the Romans, and only the Romans, who had the power to condemn or to acquit. And ultimately, it was the Romans who carried out the final act. In recent years, we've had the opportunity to excavate in Jerusalem the area occupied in the first century by the Sadducees and other members of the temple aristocracy. We were fortunate to have found the very homes of these wealthy families situated on the edge of the Tyropoeon Valley overlooking the Temple Mount. These homes were destroyed on the 8th of Elul, only 30 days after the destruction of the temple on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av in 70 A.D. Here in this recently opened museum, we see the remains of the homes of these luxury-loving members of the court who lived here right on the edge of the valley overlooking the Temple Mount. We're fortunate to have with us today Dr. Amichai Mazar, a longtime friend and colleague, and professor of archaeology at the Hebrew Museum here in Jerusalem. Dr. Mazar assisted in the excavations here on this site. Ami, from your archaeological excavations here on the site, what can you tell us about the site, the excavations? Who started the excavations and how long were they in progress?
Well, we started excavating here in 1969 when the government of Israel decided to rehabilitate the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, of the old city of Jerusalem, which was in ruins up to the 6 Days War and after the 6 Days War. The excavations was directed by Professor Nachman Avigad from the Hebrew University until 1978. I assisted him during the first years of the excavations here, and this was a very special archaeological project because we had here a chance to discover the homes, the houses, which you mentioned, of the rich Jews of Jerusalem during the Second Temple period. This museum, where we visit now, it's called the Herodian Quarter, was designed and planned by Professor Avigad, and it's one, I would say, one of the most vivid and interesting archaeological museums that can be visited nowadays in Israel.
What is it that we're seeing right here down in front of us? I mean, it looks like some kind of a tunnel.
Yes, just here in this place, beyond the western edge of this house, separating between this house and the house next to it on the west, there was a small street, an alley, and below the floor of this street we can see a huge drainage canal. One can walk in this drain, which is about 6 or 7 feet high and covered by huge stone slabs. This is a small part of a huge drainage system of Jerusalem. We found other parts of this drainage system in other parts of Jerusalem. Parallel drain canals like this built up crossed the entire city from north to south in a grid. Now we know from the writings of Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian who describes the war, the great war of the Jewish zealots against the Romans in 67 to 70 AD, we know that when the upper city of Jerusalem was conquered by Titus at Chet Be'elul, yes, the 8th of the month of Elul, in the summer of the year 70, a lot of the Jews fled into these drainage canals, and there they found their death. And indeed, in one point in the Jewish quarter, we found in one of such drainage canals, we found skeletons, evidence for human skeletons, probably some of those zealots who were killed here in the drains at this day.
Now, there were 3 homes here just in a row, and this is the second of the homes. About how large was this particular house?
Well, this particular one we don't really know because this one is not completely excavated. This one we found here only the living room and few rooms around. But we know the size of the neighboring house to the east, the lower house, which is a huge palace. In fact, it's much more than just a house. It's a palace. Its area on the ground floor is about 600 square meters, which is about 5,400 square feet. We know that there were also cellars and probably a second floor for this house. So we can calculate its general area in something like, I would say, about 1,500 square feet.
15,000.
15,000 square feet, which is quite a large area, even for a large home today, I would say, yes. That, this is a palace, probably used by one of the highest ranking families of Jerusalem during that time, perhaps even by the high priest or, you know, one of the nobles, the Tzedukite families of those days.
Now that's the home just behind us. Exactly. Let's walk down there and have a look at it. Now, Ami, this is the lowest of the homes that were excavated here along the Tarapian Valley. This is the model of the third and the largest home. You mentioned up above that this was about 15,000 square feet. That's a sizable house. What else can you tell us about it, Ami?
Well, we are standing right away in the middle of the central courtyard. It was an open courtyard, open to the sky. We are standing on the flagstones of this courtyard, and here in the model you can see it inside. That's a typical feature of Middle Eastern houses throughout the ages. Even today, in the old houses of the old city, you have courtyards in the middle of the house. The courtyards provides air and light to the rooms all around it. We have 4 wings of the house all around the courtyard. Water supply was one of the major problems in these houses, not only for drinking and cooking, but also for washing in the ritual bath. We know that each Jewish home of those days had at least one ritual bath. In this particular house, we have more than one. We have several ritual baths here, larger and smaller, and they needed a lot of water for these ritual baths. Now, the water were collected just from the runoff water, rainwater, which were collected from the roof and the courtyard itself. That means the entire area of the roof and the courtyard, which was about 5,000 square feet, this water could be collected into huge cisterns. And in fact we have, and you can see even in the section through the model, down here inside the major courtyard, and here we can see it in the courtyard itself, we have openings of huge cisterns, about 400 square cubic of water. A lot of water could be stored here from the end of the winter, like March, until the beginning of the following winter, November. Water in the house, the major water supply of the house, in fact the only water supply of the house, was were these huge cisterns.
Now, was this water, Ami, used principally for the ritual immersion bath, the mikvaot, or for all purposes?
For all purposes, yes, but definitely also for the ritual immersion bath. But we have to remember that for the ritual immersion bath, they needed some quantity of rainwater which were not collected in cisterns, because this is a Jewish law. For this, they had a very special arrangements, which, by the way, are still kept by Jews up to our own days, and we can see them here in these excavations. Now, this part of the house, this large, huge wing, contained the major reception hall of this house. As I said, the house was probably a palace of one of the richest and most important families of Jerusalem during that times. They had probably banquets and so on in their home, and we have here a large hall just at the back of us. You can see it here in the model. It's a very large hall with beautiful plastered walls. The walls were plastered in a special kind of plaster called stucco. That's a Roman technique, and the stucco here imitates stones, ashlar stones. This is a style which developed in Rome. It is known to us from Rome itself, from Pompeii and so on. And here the Jews of Jerusalem imitated this style, or just used this same technique in their homes. Below this plaster, in several rooms, we excavated earlier phases of these wall decorations, and there we have colored frescoes, wall paintings, just as were used in those times in most of the Roman rich houses of Italy, of North Africa, of Turkey, and so on. The Jews here also painted their walls in the typical fresco technique of those times, but again, I emphasize, without using any motifs of human beings, any pagan motifs, or any even animal motifs. Just geometric designs, and that's it. So they were very strict about keeping the law of the Torah.
Now, I noticed as we were walking through the house some very beautiful pottery vessels. Can you tell us anything about those?
The finds in this house were very rich, and they are an evidence for the quality, the high quality of life during those days among the rich families, the Tzedukites. I don't believe that simple Pharisees, yes, of the city could afford such vessels. We have here Roman terra sigillata. That means pottery that was produced in Italy and was imported to Jerusalem during those times. We have also very beautiful glass pieces. Here on the wall, just opposite us, we can see a large picture of a glass jug. The original is now in the Israel Museum. This piece of glass was made and is signed by one of the most famous glass makers of those times. He lived in the city of Tyre. His name was Anion. And here we have one of three pieces, complete pieces, which were found. One is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The other one was found here. The third one is in a private collection in Tel Aviv. That means that these people in Jerusalem really could afford these expensive tableware, glass vessels, and other pieces of luxury. For example, we have here a showcase which show just all kinds of little glasses, little bottles and boxes and equipment related to perfumes, to cosmetics. Yes, so the women in this house used high quality perfumes and cosmetics of those times.
So basically we're talking about, again, as we mentioned earlier, the luxury-loving members of the court, the temple aristocracy, the Sadducees.
No question. We know that Jerusalem during the Second Temple period was divided into two major parts, the upper city and the lower city. The upper city is here where we are now standing, the Jewish quarter, which is in absolute levels higher than the temple itself. We are about 50 meters here higher than the temple itself. Now, the particular house in which we are standing was located just on the edge of the Tyropoion Valley. That means someone who stood on the balconies or the roof of this house could look into the courtyards of the Temple Mount. He was above the temple. This was a very high, expensive part of Jerusalem in those days. While the Pharisees, the poorer people, lived in the lower city. The lower city, the upper part of the Tyropoion, and the place where the old city of Jerusalem was in the first temple period, there we have only poor houses from this period, and they probably couldn't afford all these beautiful things that we can see here, of course, naturally.
So if we happen to be in this house in the first century and just looking out the door, we would be looking right over the Tyropoion Valley to the Temple Mount.
This is correct. This is correct. If we shall go out from this door, we shall actually see the Temple Mount just in front of us.
It's important that we understand that all of the actors on the stage in this historical drama that is unfolding for us in the first century, the good guys, those who followed Jesus, who gladly accepted His word and who followed Him everywhere that He went, were Jews. And the bad guys, those who conspired for His death, were Jews. But the bad guys represented only a very small minority from the rich temple aristocracy, and ultimately it was the Romans who carried out the final act. Jesus only posed a threat to those who were a part of the temple aristocracy by exposing them for their hypocrisy. I recently viewed a videotape produced by a fundamentalist preacher. The tape was entitled The Other Israel with Ted Pike. It was one of the most vicious, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic diatribes that it has ever been my misfortune to see. Not only was this video disgustingly in error, but it was an insult to one's intelligence. Everything this self-righteous, self-appointed authority had to say about the Jews was terribly in error, although most of his statements were so subtly couched in half-truths to such an extent that the average Christian would probably not be able to catch the error. In one of his opening statements, he declared it was the Pharisees who killed Jesus. And then he entered into a diatribe against the Pharisees and their hypocrisy. Well, it just so happens that the teachings of Jesus were so Pharisaic that many scholars believe that Jesus actually belonged to the sect of the Pharisees. He may, and he may have not. He may not have been an actual card-carrying Pharisee, so to speak, but one thing that we can say with certainty, and that is that his teachings were more in harmony with those of the Pharisees than any other of the sects of his day. And remember, he even one time told his disciples, "You do what the Pharisees say, because they sit in Moses' seat, but don't do what they do." And another interesting fact is that there is no one more critical of the Pharisees than the Pharisees themselves. And thus, Jesus' criticism of Pharisaic hypocrisy was quite natural. In fact, in the Talmud, in Sotah 22b, we have listed 7 different classes of Pharisees that the Pharisees categorized and used to make fun of themselves. Let's look at these 7 different classes. I think you'll find it both enlightening and humorous. The first they called the shoulder Pharisee. Those were the Pharisees who carried their religious duties upon their shoulder like a burden. And you remember Jesus' words? He said, "Come unto me, all you are laboring under a heavy load, and I will give you rest," in Matthew 11:28. And this no doubt referred to the heavy burden of religious duty that some believed that they were carrying upon their shoulders. Then secondly, there was the "wait just a moment" Pharisee, who was always saying, "Well, could you excuse me for just a moment? I need to run out and perform some kind of a mitzvah or a good deed." Then there was the bruised Pharisee, who, in his anxiety to avoid even looking upon a woman, walked with his eyes down, so that he always kept running into walls and bruising his head and bloodying his nose and face. Then there was the pestle Pharisee, who walked with his head bowed down like a pestle in a mortar. Then there was the calculating Pharisee, who was forever saying, "Tell me what good deed that I might do to offset a bad deed." He wanted to go out and do as much bad as he could do, but he wanted to know what good deeds he could do to offset his bad deeds. But then notice the 2 last categories. The God-fearing Pharisee, who was like Job, and the God-loving Pharisee, who is like Abraham. Notice the stinging satire directed against some of the Pharisees. We might label them as the ugly Pharisees. But also notice the recognition of the beautiful Pharisee, the God-loving, the God-obeying Pharisee, who, without a doubt, was representative of the majority of all of the rank-and-file Pharisees of Jesus' day. Let it not be forgotten that even long after he became a believer, the Apostle Paul publicly declared, "I am a Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, the descendant of a long line of Pharisees." And it must be remembered that many of the first believers were Pharisees. Another important fact for us to remember, and that is whether Jesus was a Pharisee or whether he was not. One thing is true, and that is that his teachings were Pharisaic, and they struck at the very heart of Sadducee theology. It may be significant to note that after the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D., that the sect of the Sadducees ceased to exist and are no more within the context of historic Judaism. In our next program, we will discuss the nature of the early Christian movement and further elaborate on this question of who killed Jesus. And we'll be going back to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where this new movement had its beginning. Welcome to Treasures of the Jewish World. In our last program, we were discussing the question, who really killed Jesus? And we noted in our program that actually in this historical drama that takes place in the first century, that all of the actors on the stage are Jews. The good guys who follow Jesus, who accept his teaching, are Jews. The bad guys, represented by a very small minority of the temple aristocracy, the Sadducees, they're also Jews. Who was it, however, that followed Jesus? Well, remember, at the preaching of the Apostle Peter on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem, we're told in Acts chapter 2, verse 38 and following, that 3,000 gladly accept his words and are baptized. Did you ever wonder where these events might have taken place? And again, we want to emphasize, who were these people? They were Jews. Today we're going to take you to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to look at the location where these very events might have transpired. We just recently and when I say recently, of course, I'm talking about within the last few years, have been able to excavate all along this area of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And we've made a number of important and startling discoveries. We excavated over in this area along the southern wall of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and we found a monumental staircase that led up to double and triple doors. These steps were known as the Huldah gates, after the prophetess Huldah from the time of Josiah, 621 BC, as you'll be seeing in our clip from the Temple Mount. But in this monumental staircase, we found something else of importance. We found a huge ritual immersion bath complex, so large, as a matter of fact, that all 3,000 that accepted Jesus at the preaching of the gospel by Peter could have been immersed here according to the Jewish method of ritual immersion in only a few minutes' time. Remember, the Jewish method of ritual immersion was always self-administered, and this complex was so large that all 3,000 could probably have immersed themselves here within a 20 to 30 minute period of time. That answers another important question for us when Peter says, repent and be baptized, is where were they baptized? Well, come and go with me to the Temple Mount, and let's have a look at this very interesting treasure. We're standing today at the southern wall of the temple compound, the scene of many exciting events in biblical times. Just behind me are the sealed gates, known in biblical days as the Huldah gates, named after the prophetess Huldah from the time of Josiah, 621 BC. In biblical days, the worshipers coming here to the Temple Mount would enter through these gates, ascend a flight of steps, and then come out up above into the temple compound proper. Also, along the southern wall of the temple compound is this huge ritual immersion bath complex. It begins approximately here and continues on to the west a considerable distance. This ritual immersion bath complex is so large, in fact, that literally hundreds of people could come and immerse themselves here before entering into the temple compound according to the Jewish method of ritual immersion, which was always self-administered, in just a relatively short period of time. And another interesting thing about these ritual immersion baths is that they are the highest order of ritual immersion bath according to Jewish law. Maim Chaim, or living water, having channeled spring water from natural springs to the south near Bethlehem through water aqueducts that wound their way through the Judean hills here to the ritual immersion bath complex at the Temple Mount. Another very interesting thing that we see here at the Temple Mount along the southern wall is this huge monumental staircase. This monumental staircase was the scene of many important events in biblical days because, according to Jewish sources, it was here that the Jews assembled together during the three pilgrim festivals of the year: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, or Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Notice something very interesting about the staircase, and by the way, these are the actual stones, the original stones of the monumental staircase that we uncovered in our excavations here at the Temple Mount. Notice one short step
one long step, one short step, one long step. Was constructed this way so that when the pilgrims came here and ascended the steps that led up to the double gates, the Hulda gates, and then through the gates on up to the temple compound proper, they would have to do so in an attitude of reverence and humility. Again, this particular site is the scene of many important events in biblical history, perhaps the most important for Christians being the event that is recorded for us in Acts chapter 2. We're on top of Mount Zion in a building at the traditional tomb of David the King. You can see behind me in the room the cenotaph where, according to tradition, David the King was buried. And we're going to be walking through the room and going up a flight of steps. And immediately above us is another room that is the traditional room of the Last Supper. The ordinary tourist that is brought here is brought to David's tomb and then led out this door, and by a very circuitous route is brought around and then up into the room itself, the traditional room of the Last Supper. Now, my friend and colleague, Moshe, is going to open the door for us here. And rather than us taking the long way around, we're going to go up this flight of steps that's going to bring us out into the site of the traditional room of the Last Supper above. Coming up the flight of steps and into the room, we're able to look around and see immediately the vaulted arches, typical Crusader architecture. The room dates from the Crusader and the late Arab periods. And something very interesting, here on the wall, on these pillars, are coats of arms from the various Crusader orders. After the Crusader period and during the late Arab period, this structure was converted into a Muslim mosque. And if you'll notice over on the eastern wall, you see the niche in the wall called the mihrab, toward which the Muslim faces Mecca and prays 5 times a day during the time of prayer. And we can still see on the walls evidences from the Muslim period with the inscription here on the wall in Arabic that says that it is to our God that we pray. Now, as we look around the room, this room, the traditional site for the Last Supper, and the events that are recorded in Acts chapter 2, the question immediately presents itself, could those events have taken place here in this room? Given the fact that there were some 120 people who were present during the events, and then some 3,000 people who responded to the proclamation of the gospel as proclaimed by the Apostle Peter. And the answer to the question is, as we look at the room, the size of the room, and then of course the architecture, that it was obviously that the events could not have taken place here. Now, if they didn't take place here, where did they take place? Because of what we found in our archaeological excavations here at the Temple Mount, and because of what we read in Jewish sources, I think we can say with a high degree of certainty that the events that are recorded for us in Acts chapter 2 took place here, on this monumental staircase, and not in some upper room. Given, number one, the number of people that were involved, and number two, the statement in the text in Acts chapter 2 that reads, "And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the whole house in which they were sitting." Now, in Hebrew, house is habayit, and we have to remember that this material was originally Hebrew and not Greek. Habayit can mean not only house, but it can mean also temple. And this whole area here is known today as Har Habayit, or the Mount of the House, namely the temple. But now the question of importance. Verse 5 reads, "And there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout, from every nation." From Acts chapter 2, we see 5 things of importance in the text. Number 1, the people were Jews. Number 2, they were from many different countries. Number 3, it was on the day of Pentecost, one of the 3 pilgrim festivals in which all of the Jews from all over came here to this place to assemble together. Number 4, they were all gathered together in one place. And number 5, it says they were sitting in the house. They would come here, sit on the steps, house being Habayit, or the Temple Mount. When Peter stands up in the midst of them and preaches the first gospel sermon, proclaims the good news, and the people, having been stirred in their hearts at his proclamation, ask, "What shall we do?" Peter replies, "Repent and be baptized and receive the Holy Spirit. For this promise is unto you, to your children, and to all that are afar off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call." Now, to whom is Peter speaking? Of whom is it speaking in verse 41 in Acts chapter 2, when it says, "Therefore, those who accepted and welcomed his message were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls." The answer is that they were all Jews. Now, why is that important? Because there have been a number of unfortunate misconceptions in Christendom that have resulted not only in division and factionalism, but in grave injustices. These misconceptions are, number 1, that the Jews rejected Jesus. Number 2, that the Jews crucified Jesus. Number 3, that because the Jews crucified Jesus, they were cut off and replaced by the church, and that the church today is the real Israel. The facts of history forcibly substantiate that none of these misconceptions are true. The facts are that it was the Jews to whom Jesus came. It was the Jew who followed him everywhere. And it was the Jew that when Peter proclaimed the first gospel sermon, gladly responded to his message and was undoubtedly immersed in these ritual immersion baths here in this complex at the southern wall of the temple compound. It's interesting that it was only on rare occasions that Jesus even conversed with a non-Jew. And we know historically that for the first 10 years after the establishment of this new movement, that was a movement strictly within the framework of the historical Judaism of Jesus' day. There were no non-Jews that were accepted into that movement, except through the door of Judaism.
I'm sure that the information that we're sharing with you here in Treasures of the Jewish World is new for many of you. You have not generally known that the Jew did in fact accept Jesus, and that the Jewish church was very vibrant, strong, alive in Israel as far as into the 4th and the 5th centuries of the present era and even beyond. Professor David Flusser, one of my colleagues in the Jerusalem School for the study of the Synoptic Gospels, and perhaps the foremost authority in the whole world in New Testament studies, has pointed out in his new book, Jewish Sources in Early Christianity, that there were, in fact, many followers of Jesus in the 1st century and onward. And I'd like to just quote briefly from his book. Several statements that he makes are quite pertinent for us in our study. Reading from page number 81, Jesus' Jewish disciples and their followers. Jesus was a faithful Jew. Now keep in mind that this is a Jew who is writing in this book, the head of the Department of Comparative Religions at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he says Jesus was a faithful Jew. His personal disciples and their followers who resided in Palestine were Jews who had studied Torah and were strict in their observance of the commandments. As against the Gentiles who accepted Christianity, these disciples regarded Jesus as a great prophet and as the Messiah. These were Jews who despaired for a brief moment of their faith in Jesus the crucified, and who regained their faith through their belief in His resurrection. They were usually simple people, often poor, and they passed on the sayings of Jesus. In its struggle against Gentile Christianity, as the church moves to the west, the Greek and the Roman church began to incorporate into their theology all kinds of pagan practices. Professor Flusser emphasized that Jewish Christianity continued to emphasize the Judaism of Jesus. The Jewish Christians are known to us not only from the New Testament, but also from Christian Apocrypha and other outside sources. Professor Shlomo Pines, Professor Flusser records, has just recently discovered an early source in an Arabic adaptation made in the 10th century, which proves that the last groups of such Jewish Christians were in existence well into the 10th century of the present era. Now think about that. What is happening on the scene historically in the 10th century? Remember when the Crusades began? In the 11th century. And so we're right at the beginning of the Crusades. So we know of the existence of these Jewish Christian congregations well up into the time of the Crusades. But then during the Crusades, of course, the church to the west came to Israel and to the Holy Land, and in their attempt to wrest the sacred sites out of the hands of the infidels, which included not just the Muslims, but also Jews, the Jewish church disappears. Professor Flusser continues, these Jewish Christians were persecuted by the church and regarded as infidels and heretics who had gone the wrong way and had attempted to Judaize Christianity. That's in spite of the fact that this movement had its origins right in the midst of the historic Judaism of the first century. Not only, Professor Flusser continues, did the disciples and followers of the Christians who lived in Jerusalem and in the Galilee continue in their way, but there were also other Jewish groups with different views who joined Christianity. So, if there were so many Jewish Christians, what happened to them? Well, Professor Flusser tells us on page number 87. During the Roman wars, the Jewish Christian groups immigrated to Pella across the Jordan, and later on they returned to Jerusalem. After the second Jewish revolt that ended in 135, following the death of Bar Kokhba, they were not permitted to reside within Jerusalem because they were Jews. Notice that the Jewish Christians were considered by the Romans as Jews and were not allowed to reside in Jerusalem. Then the heads of the community, who were circumcised, that is, the Jewish believers, immigrated to Lebanon. Kalkaba in Lebanon was the center for Jewish Christians of all the various streams, for those who were closer to the church as well as for those who were closer to Judaism. From the 2nd century onward, Christianity forbade the Jewish Christians to keep the commandments and persecuted them as heretics. Because of this persecution, a growing opposition to the Gentile church spread among the Jewish Christians. The Jewish Christians were reminded of their Judaism and began to feel an increasing sense of identification with the people of Israel. Unlike the Gentile Christians who faced east in their prayers, the Jewish Christians continued to face the ruined temple in the holy city of Jerusalem. They maintained that the proper language of teaching in which the early Gospels had been written was Hebrew, and that when the Gospels had been translated into other languages, it was as though they had been forged. Now, let's reiterate for just a moment. After the resurrection, and here at the Temple Mount, on the day of Pentecost, it was the Jew who accepted Jesus. And it was the Jew who believed him to be the promised Messiah. By 50 A.D., only 20 short years after the events that transpired here on the day of Pentecost, there were perhaps as many as 50,000 to 60,000 Jewish believers in the city of Jerusalem alone. We can trace the development of the Jewish church well into the 5th and 6th centuries, even as late as the 10th century. So, it is a fallacy and a grave error, an error that has led to so much persecution and anti-Semitism to declare that the Jews did not follow Jesus, that the Jews killed Jesus, that the Jews rejected Jesus, when, in fact, the opposite is true. And I hope that you have enjoyed our program, that you've enjoyed our study on this most important subject, and if you have, we'd love to hear from you. We would appreciate your letters of support. Just drop us a note at the address at the end of the program, and we'll appreciate it. Welcome to Treasures of the Jewish World. In our program today, we're going to be discussing one of the greatest treasures that Judaism has given to the world, the Bible. Today we're going to examine some of our recent archaeological finds that have illuminated our understanding of this Jewish document, its preservation, transmission, authenticity, and the miraculous story of the language in which it was communicated, the uniqueness of the Hebrew language, the only language that lay dormant for a period of time and then was later revived. So that the Bible and the language in which it was principally written, Hebrew, are two of the most precious treasures of the Jewish world.
Here, along the shore of the Dead Sea, along the edge of the Judean escarpment, a Bedouin from the Ta'amra tribe, who lived just over these hills in the Judean desert to the south of Bethlehem, found here manuscripts or scrolls of the Bible in the original Hebrew that were 1,000 years older than any other known Hebrew manuscript.
This is cave number 1 at Qumran, where the original discovery of what was to prove to be the most important textual discovery ever made took place. As you can see, it's considerably off the beaten path, and although many people visited Qumran, the community that gave us the scrolls, and have had the opportunity to see caves 4 and 5, where further scroll discoveries were made in 1952, very few people, except for scholars and for the very adventuresome, have ever visited this site where the original scroll discovery was made. Of the original scrolls, 8 are in our possession. The Genesis Apocryphon, the War of the Sons of Darkness and the Sons of Light, the Manual of Discipline, the Habakkuk Commentary, the Thanksgiving Scroll, and the recently published Temple Scroll, as well as 2 scrolls of the book of Isaiah. The first scroll containing all 66 chapters, and the second one the last 30 chapters.
In 1952, during the archaeological excavations here at the little community of Qumran, workmen accidentally discovered 2 man-made caves adjacent to and lower down than the level on which the physical structures here at Qumran stood. In these 2 caves, some 40,000 scroll fragments were found, representing some 400 biblical books, along with non-biblical books as well, and many were represented by 2 or more different copies. The scroll finds here along the Dead Sea were revolutionary and resulted in profound changes in our long-held opinions about the Bible. The 3 facts that most dramatically affected our understanding of the Bible were the scrolls, both biblical and non-biblical, are almost entirely in Hebrew, with very few exceptions. Of the biblical manuscripts, most of the books were represented not by just 1 or more copies, but by 1 or more versions. This fact was to have a dramatic effect upon a long-standing theory regarding biblical interpretation that had been given to us by the German school of scholarship in the 18th and 19th centuries. As it was developed in its simple form and without going into all of the numerous variations, this theory was called higher biblical criticism, or the documentary hypothesis. It stated that the Bible was comprised of 4 different source documents: the J source, or the Jehovah source, dated no earlier than 850 BC, the E source, or the Elohim source, 750 BC, the D source, or Deuteronomy source, from 621 BC, the time of Josiah, and the P source, or the priestly source, about 500 BC. The theory proposed that Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly had assembled the Bible from all these various sources, and that from the time of their work, approximately 400 BC, until the present day, the traditional or the Masoretic text, as it is known, of the Hebrew Bible had remained unaltered or unchanged, so that through the usage of divine names, through analysis of parallel or duplicate accounts, and by diction and style, one was able to go to the biblical text and to divide it up, or to assign to it its various sources. With the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls here at Qumran, higher biblical criticism and the documentary hypothesis came tumbling down. The late William Foxwell Albright, one of the greatest of the scholars of his day, wrote as early as 1967, and I quote, "Much nonsense has been repeated about what constitutes orthodoxy in dealing with the text of the Old and the New Testaments. It's even been asserted recently that the Pentateuch was written by Moses in the exact form that has come down to us in the Hebrew Bible. So-called critical scholarships was partly responsible for this approach, since 19th century critics insisted that the text of our Hebrew Bible had come down from the time of its supposed final editing in the time of Ezra without any appreciable change. Today, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that this is not true. There were different recensions of the Pentateuch, and no immutable form can be attributed to any part of it. It is quite impossible to cut the Pentateuch up into a patchwork of JEP with any hope of increasing our knowledge of what actually happened. That the Pentateuchal law is substantially Mosaic in origin, and that patriarchal and Mosaic historical traditions are astonishingly early and dependable, seems, in my opinion, certain." End of quote. However, another point about the scrolls is even more startling, and the effects of this discovery even more profound. It had been basically the German school of scholarship that gave us the documentary hypothesis. That had proposed that the New Testament was written in Greek, and that the language of the people of the first century in Judea, as well as the language of Jesus, and the language in which he taught, was Aramaic. Today, again, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that both of these statements are incorrect. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we note that the commentaries on the biblical scrolls, such as the Habakkuk scroll, or the Habakkuk commentary, as it's also known, were in Hebrew. As a result, scholars began to rethink existing theories about the spoken language of the people of Judea in the first century, and in particular, the language of Jesus. As a result, scholars here in Israel, working in the field, are almost unanimously agreed that the language of the people of Judea in the first century and the language of Jesus, the language in which he taught, was Hebrew and not Greek or Aramaic, and the language in which the earliest gospel, or the account of the life of Jesus, was written in Hebrew and not in Greek. And that fact has profound implications relative to our understanding of the person of Jesus and of his teachings. I'd like to quote again, this time from the book entitled Jewish Sources in Early Christianity, written by one of my colleagues here in Israel in the Jerusalem School for the Study of the Synoptic Gospels, Professor David Flusser. He is one of the outstanding New Testament scholars in the world today, the chairman of the Department of Comparative Religions here at the Hebrew University. And on page number 11 in his book, he writes, "The spoken languages among the Jews of that period were Hebrew, Aramaic, and to an extent Greek. Until recently, it was believed by numerous scholars that the language spoken by Jesus' disciples was Aramaic. It's possible that Jesus did, from time to time, make use of the Aramaic language. But during that period, Hebrew was both the daily language and the language of study. Today, after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bar Kokhba letters, and in the light of more profound studies of the language of the Jewish sages, it is accepted that most people were fluent in Hebrew. There is thus no grounds for assuming that Jesus did not speak Hebrew. And when we are told in Acts 21:40 that Paul spoke Hebrew, we should take this piece of information at face value. This question of the spoken language is especially important for understanding the doctrines of Jesus. There are sayings of Jesus which can be rendered both into Hebrew and Aramaic, but there are some that can be only rendered into Hebrew, and none of them can be only rendered into Aramaic. One that can thus demonstrate the Hebrew origins of the Gospels by retranslating them into Hebrew. It appears that the earliest documents concerning Jesus were written works taken down by his disciples after his death. Their language was early rabbinic Hebrew with strong undercurrents of biblical Hebrew. Even in the books of the New Testament, which were originally composed in Greek, such as the Pauline epistles, there are clear traces of the Hebrew language, and the terminology in those books of the New Testament, which were composed in Greek, is often intelligible only when we know the original Hebrew terms. In these books, we can trace the influence of the Greek translation of the Bible side by side with the influence of the Hebrew original. It was the finds in the Dead Sea Caves here at Qumran that revolutionized our understanding of the Bible and of the words of Jesus.
As the result of our continuing research, many scholars, especially those working actively in the field, have come to a much greater appreciation for the genuineness and the authenticity of the biblical text, as well as the miracle of its preservation and transmission than ever before. The Dead Sea Scrolls, along with many other archaeological evidences such as inscriptions on coins, coffins, and monuments, have all established conclusively that the language of Jesus and the people of Judea in the first centuries BC and AD was Hebrew. And if you would like further documentation on this subject, you can find it in this little book, Understanding the Difficult Words of Jesus, written by one of my colleagues in Israel, Mr. David Biven, and myself. And you can write for further information. Hebrew, the language, is not only a great treasure that the people of God have given to the world, but the story of its origin, development, dormancy, and revival is fascinating and unique. Hebrew is unique as a language in that it is the only language still spoken today for which we can trace the history of its development over a period of 4,000 years. Plus, it is unique in that it is the only language that lay dormant for about 1,500 years and was then revived and continues today as the spoken language of present-day Israel. In this next clip, we will trace the history of the Hebrew language and the man who was the single driving force behind its revival in modern times. We're visiting today in Jerusalem in one of the oldest quarters outside of the walls of the old city. This quarter is known as the Abyssinian Quarter, and we're visiting in the home of the former ambassador to Finland, Mr. Mordecai Lador. He's been kind enough to invite us into his home, which is a piece of history in and of itself, as it was here in this building that the first Jewish committee outside of the walls of the old city met back in the late 1800s. This whole area was built around 1870, 1878, and we've come here to this place to tell you one of the most exciting, moving, and interesting stories in what we might call modern Jewish history. After the Second Jewish Revolt with Bar Kokhba, around 132 to 135 of the present era, the use of Hebrew as a spoken language gradually declined. The Jews were dispersed to the four corners of the earth, and by the 4th and 5th centuries of the present era and onward, the language was preserved largely as the language of prayer in the synagogue. And yet, even during the time when the language reached its lowest level of use, there was even then a sense in which the language held the people of the diaspora together, as the language remained a vehicle of correspondence between the dispersed, between those who had been scattered to the various countries of the world. The language became the vehicle of correspondence. They had become a part of a different culture. They spoke many different languages, and yet Hebrew, the language, was the common thread that continued to hold the people of the diaspora together. The story of its revival is a story of human determination, dedication, sacrifice, and even, if you will, obsession. We might even say a magnificent obsession. The story is told in this book entitled The Tongue of the Prophets, written by Robert St. John, a fascinating biography of Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of modern Hebrew. Eliezer ben Yehuda was born in a small town in Lithuania in 1858. He was educated in Russia and France, but it was in Paris that he conceived the idea to which he was to devote his life. In the preface to his dictionary, he wrote, "In those days, it was as if the heavens had suddenly opened up." Ben Yehuda realized that the Jews could never have a country of their own or any national identity unless they had a common language. Almost unaided, Ben Yehuda revived the Hebrew language and helped lay the cornerstone for the new state of Israel. In 1881, with practically no money and in the worst possible health, the doctors had told him, as a matter of fact, that he only had a few months to live. But nonetheless, he set out for Palestine. In 1881, the young man, Ben Yehuda, brought his young wife from France to Jerusalem, and it was here that they lived, in this quarter, on this street, and in the house just immediately behind us. Eliezer ben Yehuda is today considered the father of modern Hebrew. He was one of the first proponents of a homeland for the Jews on their ancestral soil. He was convinced that the scattered Jews could never become united in their own land unless Hebrew was revived as their spoken language. At that time, Yiddish, the language of European Jewry, was largely spoken by the Jews of Israel, who even interestingly enough had an aversion to the speaking of the language that they considered to be the holy language, the language of prayer. Ben Yehuda, however, decided that only Hebrew would be spoken in his house, and his son Ben Sion became the first native speaker of Hebrew in 1500 years. Interestingly enough, Ben Yehuda met with much resistance, but he persisted, and as the language grew, the Hebrew Language Academy was organized to deal with problems confronting the old new language. Ben Yehuda was fortunate enough to see his dream realized before his death. Within only 40 short years after his immigration to the Holy Land, to Israel, to this place, Hebrew had again become a living language. After the reestablishment of the State of Israel in 1948, as the Jews began to return to their homeland, Hebrew, the language, would be the one common thread that would once again bind the peoples together. Ben Yehuda's contribution to the revival of modern Hebrew not only was the thread that would once again bind the people together, but it also led to a new era in biblical study in which we once again understand the importance of Hebrew to the understanding of the Bible as a whole, and not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well, and especially for the understanding of the words of Jesus. Let me give you just one example from our book, Understanding the Difficult Words of Jesus, a passage that has been often misquoted and misunderstood. Matthew 16:19, "Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." What does that mean? Well, the Hebrew words for bind and loose appear with more than one meaning in the Old Testament. Bind, for example, can mean tie up, imprison, hitch. But by the time of Jesus, the word bind had acquired an additional meaning, forbid. Similarly, loose had acquired the opposite meaning, permit. These meanings, bind and loose, are the ones we read in our Greek text or the English translation. But for the rabbis, bind meant to forbid and loose meant to permit. And these are the meanings that we find frequently in rabbinic literature. The rabbis were constantly called upon by the community to interpret scriptural commands. Was such and such an action permitted? Was such and such a thing or a person ritually clean? The Bible, for example, forbids working on Saturday, but the Bible doesn't define work. As a result, the rabbis were called upon to declare what an individual was and was not permitted to do on the Sabbath. And they bound or prohibited certain activities, and they loosed or they allowed other activities. And the Mishnah is filled with other rabbinic rulings on what is permitted and what is forbidden. The question is now, what is the practical application in all of this for us? Well, today a lot of Christians go around binding the devil and loosing the angels as if God's got them tied up someplace. But, you see, Jesus, in speaking to his disciples, said, I'm going to go away. You're going to be left behind, and you're going to have to make certain decisions. And so whatever you permit, God will endorse, or heaven will endorse. Whatever you forbid, God will forbid. The implication being, of course, is that whatever they forbade, or whatever they permitted or allowed, would be in harmony with that which heaven or God would either forbid or allow. And so we can see how this has even much greater meaning and much greater impact for us today. That we have the authority with God in us to say, I forbid this, or I permit, or I allow this, and we have the confidence and the assurance that if that is in harmony with what heaven would permit or forbid, that we have the endorsement of a God behind us in that manner. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our program today, and if you have, we would appreciate hearing from you. Just drop us a note and let us know. You can write to the address that appears on the screen. Thank you for watching. Welcome to Treasures of the Jewish World. Today in our program we're going to be talking about a unique treasure, the land of Israel itself. Although the land of Israel is one of the smallest countries in the world, encompassing an area of only approximately 325 miles from Mount Hermon here in the north, all of the way down through the Jordan Valley, past the Sea of Galilee, to the Dead Sea, all of the way down what's called the Arava, to the bottom of our map, all of the way down to the Red Sea. And then, from the Mediterranean Sea over to the Jordan Valley, only approximately 40 miles. And yet, it's one of the most important countries in the ancient world. It was the scene of many historical events, of battles and war, as well as a hub of trade and commerce, and the land promised to Abraham and his descendants as an eternal inheritance. When Abraham first comes down into the country, he stops at a place called Bethel, the house of God, just a little bit to the north of the city of Jerusalem. And later on, Jacob here sees the vision of the ladder with the angels ascending and descending. Just an interesting side note of history, according to tradition, the famous stone of Scone under the coronation seat of the kings and queens of England was supposedly the stone from Bethel on which Jacob had cradled his head. It's here in this land that many cities, mountains, and valleys become sacred shrines associated with the worship of the one true God. For example, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim here to the north in the land of Samaria, overlooking the city of Shechem, and the city of Hebron down in the south below Jerusalem, where David reigned for the first 7.5 years of his reign. And then, of course, finally, the city of Jerusalem itself, the site of the temple of God. In a very special way, the city of God. But the history of this country begins many millennia before the time of Abraham. Our archaeological finds take us all of the way back into prehistory, into the Paleolithic or the Old Stone Age. And some of the earliest of the early man finds ever to have been found anywhere in the world have been found here in Israel. We have a very interesting program for you today, as we're going to be visiting one of the most famous of these early man sites that we've excavated, the Carmel Caves. These caves are located just along the edge of the Carmel Ridge here to the north in Israel, and very close to the present-day city of Haifa. Here, in the immediate area of these caves, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of over 160 skeletons of early man, some dating back as early as 35 to 40,000 years ago or older, and artifacts, stone tools, blades, scrapers, stone axes, and more that date back as early as 250,000 years ago. Does that pose a problem for you? Well, not to worry. Remember, I'm an archaeologist, a scientist, as well as knowing Hebrew, and I can tell you this, that as a man of science, there is no conflict between the best that we know in all of the various scientific disciplines and the biblical text once you know how to read Hebrew, and once you know what the Hebrew text is saying. In our visit to this famous site, we're going to see the caves of Tabun, Jamal, Al-Wad, and Skul, where the largest collection of Mousterian or Neanderthal skeletons was found. All of this vast span of time in which men considered this land to be their home, says something to us about the importance of Israel historically. After our visit to the Carmel Caves and our discussion of ancient Israel, we will visit with one of my colleagues in Israel from the Jerusalem School for the study of the Synoptic Gospels, Mr. Halvor Running, and we'll talk further about the importance of this land, the land of Israel. We're visiting today at the Carmel Caves along the western slope of the Carmel Ridge, here in this beautiful setting along the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Quite a lovely spot, and it must have been a very suitable spot for habitation and agriculture back in ancient times. In this small cave, actually more of a rock shelter than a cave, archaeologists discovered in 1930, about 1933 actually, one of the most significant of the early man finds ever to have been found anywhere in the world. Here in this small rock shelter, this small outcropping, was found some 12 Neanderthal skeletons, the largest collection of early man skeletons ever to have been found. They were found right here where I'm standing, and you can see today the drill holes where they came in and
drilled with drill bits underneath the skeletons and lifted the skeleton as well as the dirt in which they had been buried out of the ground and taken back to Jerusalem and placed in the museums there. Our recent archaeological finds indicate that the precursor of early man, Homo erectus, immigrated into this land from Africa no less than 1.4 million years ago. Homo erectus had been preceded by Homo habilis and other more primitive ancestors, but it was he who first dared leave the African homeland, and from here in Israel he set out to conquer the rest of the unpeopled world. Although Homo erectus was not a precursor of modern man, and he died out more than 1 million years ago, new adventurers would come along and march out of Africa to take their place. Recent archaeological discoveries, coupled together with genetic studies, have shed new light on the role ancient Israel played in the emergence of modern man. It is only here in Israel that we have clear indications of the monumental encounter between the new species known as Homo sapiens sapiens, destined to conquer the world, and the less successful descendants of Homo erectus. Our prehistoric studies here in Israel are actually a spin-off of biblical archaeology. The link between the biblical world and the prehistoric world is actually a direct one, even though we tend to ignore events before Abraham or before Noah because they have no recorded history. However, our recent discoveries clearly indicate that the prehistoric world was filled with fabulous human adventure, great leaders and peoples who dared blaze new trails into lands unknown, scientists, if you will, who made a servant of fire, created or fashioned tools from stone, cultivated food from wild grain, astronomers who learned to read the stars and chart their courses, great hunters who learned how to slay animals many times their size and strength, artists whose artifacts remain in stone, wood, ivory, and undoubtedly great literary geniuses from whom perhaps fragments of their poems or stories remain with us until this day. So, the gap between the ancient past and the present is really not all that great. And much of what happened that fused the past into the present took place here in this land.
Why was this tiny and seemingly insignificant little piece of real estate so important historically? For two reasons. One, purely secular and due to the peculiar geographic location of the country, and secondly, religious. Geographically, Israel served in ancient times as the land bridge between the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia to the north and east, and Egypt to the south and west, as well as the center for trade and commerce with the islands of the Mediterranean and the civilizations of ancient Asia Minor.
Any confrontation between the countries of Mesopotamia and Egypt in time of war, or any communication or diplomatic correspondence between the two countries in time of peace, had to come through the land of Israel. One of the most famous and best known of the ancient trade routes linking Egypt with Mesopotamia was known from the time of Moses as the Way of the Philistines. During Roman times, it was known as the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, and today in Hebrew as Derech Hayam. It entered just a little inland from the coast here at ancient Afek, or Antipatris, and continued on to the north towards the Carmel Range and the modern city of Haifa.
This ancient trade route led from Egypt along the coast and up to Mount Carmel, then through the valley of Megiddo, up the Jordan Valley, and on to Syria to the north and east, and then from thence on into Mesopotamia. Any major event between the great nations of the world either passed through this tiny country or the outcome was determined here on this soil.
From a religious perspective, the land represents the territory promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their descendants as an eternal inheritance. From the earliest of biblical times, Israel in a unique way is the country of Jehovah God, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. And although this God, the only one true living God, is omnipresent, that is, his presence is everywhere. Space does not encompass him, but he encompasses space. This country, in a very special and unique way, is his land, his country.
It was the Jewish philosopher Yehuda Halevi who said in his work Hakuzari in the 11th century, "There is no people like God's chosen people, the Jew. There is no land like God's chosen land, Israel. And there is no place where the emunah, or the Spirit of God, is felt in the hearts of his people as when his people are at home in his land." Our guest today is Halvor Running. Halvor is the assistant director of the Jerusalem School for the study of the Synoptic Gospels. He's a licensed tour guide here in Israel and a PhD candidate. His dissertation is the Hebrew background of the Synoptic Gospels, and a longtime friend. Halvor, it's a real pleasure for me to have you with me again and on our new program, Treasures of the Jewish World. And I have several questions I'd like to ask you, Halvor, that I know that you probably are as qualified as anybody in the country to answer. First one is, why is it, after over 2,500 years of history and 2 dispersions, one worldwide and lasting almost 2,000 years, that the Jewish people have clung to the memory of the land of Israel and continued to have a desire to return to their homeland?
I think of the words of James Parks, a historian who wrote a history of the land, and he said, "There have always been as many Jews in the land as the government would allow and as the economy could support, so that they've just constantly had this attachment to the land." And I think it's a very deep-seated thing that I'd like to approach from the lecture of a sociologist here in Israel, Professor Simon, who has sent questionnaires to the Jewish people in a whole variety of countries around the world, and he's asked them questions relating to Jewish identity. What makes you think you're Jewish? And he has seen, you know, the whole range of possible answers. I am a Jew and not a, and then the person has to fill in a blank. And this type of questions. And he said, look, I'm a sociologist. I'm not a prophet. And yet I dare to stand in front of you and prophesy something about Jewish identity. If a Jew thinks that his identity is only religious, or if a Jew thinks that his identity is only national, his grandchildren will no longer be Jewish. And here's this strange and wonderful thing about Jewish identity that came through in your opening comment, that this is the one identity, according to the Bible, that God has created, a national identity created by God when he chose a man, Abraham, and that family, And he chose not only a person, he chose a place. And when Abraham and that family got into this land, Genesis chapter 12, he says, this is the land that I'm going to give to you and your descendants. And you don't have national identity without connection to the place where that nationality developed. And I think that's what is the deep issue behind the connection of the Jewish people to this land, that they have an identity which is religious and national together. And that's the strength of the Jewish identity.
However, I know that you've been a guide here in the country for at least 20 years, and for about the same period of time I've been bringing people over here to Israel on historical and archaeological study seminars. And it's been my experience that many of the Christians share a similar experience in common. Many have commented to me, far too many for it to be just a coincidence, that when they get off the plane in Tel Aviv or the boat at Ashdod or Haifa, that they have this strange feeling as if in some inexplicable way they'd come home. Have you heard other non-Jews made that statement, and do you have any explanation for it?
Let me start with exactly the reverse. A Protestant pastor that I know personally who was proud that he had never set a foot in Israel. I mean, he was proud Protestant. You can worship God who is spirit and truth anywhere in the world, and that's surely true. But for him, it went along into meaning that it was almost wrong for a Christian to come to Israel. And he wouldn't stoop to such a primitive thing as to go on a pilgrimage to Israel. But then, wouldn't you know, somebody in his congregation paid his way, both for him and his wife. And that was too good an offer to turn down. And now what happens? He comes to this country and he starts visiting places where Bible events have happened, about which he's been preaching and teaching for a lifetime. He couldn't believe how excited he got. I suppose he never has become a classic pilgrim, you know, to kiss the stones in some of these places, but he has brought tour group after tour group himself out of excitement that this is a place where real events happened, where God revealed himself in history. And even if you don't have the feeling that I want to come and live here, you have the feeling that this is my spiritual home, because I don't believe in just one more philosophy of religion. I believe in God revealing himself in history. I mean, the underpinnings of the Christian faith depend on there being this land and this people, because God's style is to choose. He chooses a land and a people. He proves that he knows how to be faithful, no matter how faithful or unfaithful they are. And then if we're impressed with his faithfulness through believing in the Jewish Messiah who was in this land, we can be grafted into the people of God. And that's what the New Testament teaches. And so, as believers in the New Testament, as believers in Jesus, this land is our spiritual home. I mean, I'm a Norwegian barbarian in my background, and Odin and Thor are the storm gods, and yet I consider my spiritual heritage Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because I believe in the God of Israel. And that's how it's almost as if a person should, as a Christian in some way, feel that I've come home when he comes to this land.
However, is there a sense in which this says something to us about the importance of Israel for the Christian today?
So much so that I like to consider myself as a kind of missionary for Bible geography, because I've seen this land as a part of a yardstick on which you can measure a person's biblical faith. A yardstick with 6 notches. And it works like this, that you'll have Christians who don't believe that Jesus is coming again. That's notch number 1, backing off a biblical New Testament faith. Number 2, well, if he's not coming again, because he would obviously be coming to the Mount of Olives in this land, well, then you don't need the land of Israel, because we have a spiritual fellowship that's not, as they think, tied to the land anymore. And if you don't need the land, notch number 3, for sure you don't need a Jewish state in this land. And the next step, people you can find think that as Christians they don't need the Jewish people, that God finished with the Jewish people 2,000 years ago, did what he had to, you know, through that people up until then. And after not needing these various notches, the second coming, the land, a Jewish state, the Jewish people even, you find people who think they don't need history anymore. And then the first coming is up for grabs. And I had this experience on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. I read the opening of the Sermon on the Mount to a group of theology students. And as I finished the Beatitudes, one of those students said, you know, that's it. That is real, true religion, this Sermon on the Mount. Doesn't really matter if Jesus ever lived or not. We've got these high, wonderful, moral, ethical teachings, and that's true religion. And you see, here are your notches. And you can back off one by one, but a full biblical faith requires that we believe in God's style. And He chose a man and a family, Abraham and his family. And the next time after they had been driven out of the land and were back again, it was David and a whole nation that were following him. And that breaks up with the division of the kingdom and the exile. The third time that the people in the land are back together is when Jesus came, and the message of the God of Israel goes out to the whole world. Now we are at the fourth time in history when the people and the land are back together again, and I want to at least put that as a big question mark in the mind of any Christian as a matter for prayer and Bible reading. What is going on? Because I think the land is significant, not just as a historical antiquity, a place to come and visit these things that happened in the past, but God is active in history today, and it's worth looking very carefully and praying about what's going on in this land today.
My guest has been Halvor Running, the Assistant Director of the Jerusalem School for the Study of the Synoptic Gospels. And Halvor, I want to thank you for being with us on Treasures of the Jewish World, and I hope to see you again in the very near future.
Shalom, Lehitraot.
Did you catch Halvor's question? What's going on in this land today? Well, much, in many different ways. Politically, economically, militarily, archaeologically, biblically, but also, again, historically. Remember what we've been talking about, the importance of Israel historically. And he mentioned that this was the 5th time that the people were back in their land. Did you ever have the sense or the feeling that you were a part of history in the making? Or maybe even the fulfillment of Bible prophecy? Well, those of us that had the privilege of excavating here in this area along the southern wall of the Temple Mount had that feeling. This whole area is known as the City of David, or the dwelling place, the tabernacle area of David. And if you'll quickly turn in your Bibles to Amos chapter 9, verse 11, I want to read a very significant passage, and it tells us not just about the present day events, but something about the future of Israel. In that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen. I will close up its breaches, and I will raise up its ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old. And then it says, I'm going to bring back the exiles of my people, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink the grape juice from them, and they shall also make gardens and eat the fruit of them. And then it tells us what's going to happen ultimately to Israel. Verse 15, and I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be torn up out of their land, which I gave them, says the Lord your God. Who said it? Well, not Roy Blizzard, but the Lord God. And if you want to know what's going to happen to Israel, just read Amos chapter 9, verses 11 through 15, and you'll have the story. I hope you've enjoyed our program today here on Treasures of the Jewish World. And if you have, we would appreciate hearing from you. Just drop us a note at the address at the close of the program, and we'll appreciate it.